Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. Welcome to episode 3 of the series I've entitled The GH5 Has Me Thinking. Today, as promised, let's talk about autofocus, wrap up a few loose ends, and then I'll tell you what I've decided to do. Your mileage may vary. Now, I haven't been able to go hands-on with a GH5 yet. My usual sources couldn't snag me one, and Panasonic hasn't answered my multiple attempts to reach them. But it's okay. It's fine. They're pretty busy these days, and that's a good thing. Kudos to them. But what I did do is get my hands on what I thought would be an interesting proxy, something to help me better understand the Panasonic's manual of arms as a Sony shooter. I'm talking about this guy, the G85. Yeah, I know, it's not the same thing. But they both have DFD autofocus, dual IS, the same remote app, and similar ergonomics. The GH5 promises to have other things, improved things, but when it comes to autofocus, I suspect they're going to be pretty darn close. If the GH5 turns out to have better autofocus, that's great. And I've used the GH4 before in the GX85. But in any event, we already know it will still be contrast detect only, and this has consequences, so hold that thought. I also borrowed, thanks to recommendations from you in the comments section of episode 2, the Summilux 25mm 1.4 and the Panasonic 12 to 35 f2.8, which is tiny for 24 to 70 full frame equivalent. Still, let's just get this out of the way. I don't think it's possible for the GH5's autofocus to be as good as that in my A6300. As fast? Yeah, about. As reliable? No. As artifact-free, as in no hunting back and forth as it seeks to lock on? No. It's contrast detect versus phase detect, and contrast detect loses. Hold that thought too, because there are a number of significant buts here. When I tested the G85 and its little brother, the GX85, I saw their autofocus consistently underperform the A6300 in video mode. I first saw it with the GX85 in my 2016 Gear of the Year video. Call this use case number 1, vlogging. I saw it again with the G85 when preparing to shoot a gimbal segment for a client. Call this use case number 2, but they're both about tracking. After testing the G85 and the 6300 during pre-pro for that client tracking shot, I really felt I had no choice but to go with the A6300 and the Sony 28f2 rather than the G85 and the Sigma 30 1.4, which I really like. I saw it again when I shot another vlog segment, this time about Blackmagic's Ursa Mini Pro. I found this to be true with continuous autofocus set to on, whether it was using face recognition, tracking, or any of the other modes, and setting autofocus speed to +2. Bottom line, when I need tracking with shallow depth of field, the Sony combo is the better choice. On the other hand, when my face filled up fully half the screen, and I wasn't moving all that much, and there was nothing in the background, well, then Panny's facial recognition did well, even with very shallow depth of field, essentially on a par with the A6300. But that's not really a robust test, isn't it? Finally, when it comes to tap rack focus, I found, this can't be a surprise to anyone, how well the G85 did was a function of the scene's contrast. And once again, because its autofocus technology is contrast detect only, that rapid back and forth hunting to confirm focus, I'll call it microcycling, showed up more often than I'd like. It would have been better to focus manually. Hold this thought too. With this said, my first experiences with Sony's A6500 tap focus felt sluggish, whereas when the G85 did have enough contrast, it was much more responsive and always more responsive to the touch. On the other hand, the A6500 exhibited little of the contrast detect's signature hunting back and forth before locking onto the subject. Of course, after going hands-on with Fujinon's brilliant new MK 18-55 T2.9, okay, I already knew this before using the MK, but wow, did it drive the point home. If you want a good focus pull, use a geared cine lens. let's get to those buts I talked about. That sounds really wrong. First, the interesting thing is, no surprise, I just mentioned it, the A6300's autofocus isn't always perfect either. And when things do go wrong, the G85 is easier to correct manually with a tap on the screen rather than dropping down into a Sony menu. I expect the GH5 will be better than the G85 in this regard, at least because it has a physical joystick on the back to quickly position the autofocus point. And what I expect will be a noticeably superior viewing experience through the 3.6 million dot EVF. Second, when it comes to portrait, travel, and street still photography, 3 more use cases for what I do, the autofocus difference is diminished to insignificance. As long as you're not a spray and pray photographer, and I don't think you'd be watching this if you were, the G85 is essentially equivalent in the real world to the A6300 in these use cases, with iFocus working very well. Both the 25 1.4 and the Vario 12 to 35 focused quickly and silently, definitely on par with Sony's 28 2.0, 50 1.8, and 55 1.8, and better than Sony's 92.8 macro. Then again, sports coverage is something else. I didn't have time to test this scenario, but in my experience with a lot of Sony gear, the Sony wins. Hands down. Third, under the right circumstances, the G85 can do as well as anything out there for travel video, but right circumstances means something very specific. Just take a look at how the Vario worked while tracking this ferry side to side. Brilliant. And brilliant image quality. But it has to be said that it is much easier tracking side to side. It's really not demanding very much for any camera than tracking movement toward or away from it. And this particular scene was bright and contrasty, just about an ideal setup for the G85's autofocus system. Fourth, I only had the G85 for a few weeks, and I definitely don't know how to use it as well as I should. So, okay, fine. I'm the limitation as always. All well and good. Finally, it wasn't just sports where I was unable to test the gear. Call it all live events. Still, on this last point, I feel comfortable asserting from memory and understanding the differences between contrast detect and phase detect that while the G85 and by extension the GH5 will be fine for some live event still photography, it will not be as good as the current DSLR market like the Nikon or Canon guys or the 6300. And when it comes to video, the GH5 might not be good enough at all. With this said, I want to give the GH5 a fair chance. I'm thinking it might work better for stage productions where the lighting is tightly controlled and there's relatively little front to back movement than it would be for video journalism and sports where light and action can't be controlled to the same degree. Though again, I don't think the GH5 can be as good as the A6300 or the big guns in the DSLR world. Call it to be determined. But I want to go back for a moment to that ferry scene. Did you notice it was shot handheld? This really struck me. It made me realize that we need to talk about image stabilization when talking focus because it can contribute to autofocus success. Now, to put it bluntly, the G85's combination of IBIS and Lens IS works better than the Sony A6500. I didn't have an A6500 in-house at the same time to do side-by-side, but having used the A6500 before, I'm very comfortable making this assertion, and I think this is a big deal. It begs the question, is it worth spending an extra $500 and moving to another lens system to get the GH5 instead of getting the A6500, or spending an extra $1,000 on top of that to get an A7S2 or A7R2. Here's the proverbial bottom line on autofocus. As I've said a number of times now, I believe the GH5 won't be as precise or reliable as the A6300 in autofocus mode. So if one needs the best autofocus, Sony, or if you're a Canon shooter, Canon, or a Nikon shooter, Nikon, will still be the go-to choice. But I've come to realize that I don't need the best autofocus. I only need good enough autofocus for most of what I do. For virtually all of my still photography work, except dance, and a good chunk of the rest of what I do in video, the GH5's autofocus would likely be okay. But when it wouldn't be, like gimbal work or sports, well, refer to number 2. And manual focusing is still best for recording 2 shots and other talking headshots. Hold that thought as well. Let's turn to a number of loose ends before we get to the punchline here. What image stabilization and what focusing modes will actually be available in 4K video on the GH5. The camera within the Panasonic lineup closest to the GH5 in a number of ways is, let's say, the GX8 instead of the G85, yet it has some limitations when it comes to IS and video. I want to know that I have full 5-axis dual IS and 4K video. I want to know that I have all autofocus modes available to me in 4K video at all frame rates. How good is the GH5's 10-bhpho.to recording? And how important is the answer in any case to me? Well, A, we don't really know yet, and B, not very. It continues to be the case that I shrink from the overhead of post-capture color grading, preferring to do the work in camera. And it continues to be the case that my only distribution is through the web, compression artifacts and all. I think I'll be fine with 8-bhpho.to until I'm not. How important are the dual card slots? Well, redundant high-speed media have become critical to me. When you're recording conversations with people on location, there are no do-overs once you leave. And dumping all of that data out of the camera at high speed becomes really important. How good is the GH5's actual low-light performance? Well, we've talked about this before, but I still have questions. Turns out it's likely to be not far off from the Olympus EM1 Mark II, which in turn appears to be, according to DxOMark and DP Review, less than a stop's difference to my own A6300. Now, my own low-light tests with the G85 indicate about a stop or 2 difference between it and the A6300. I'm guessing the GH5 will be at least a stop better than the G85. So this is just a long way of triangulating to determine that the GH5 should be approaching parity with the A6300, which, hell's bells, is good enough for me given that I rarely shoot above ISO 6400, and even the G85 seemed workable at that speed. How good, I can't believe I'm asking this question, is the GH5's 1080? I switched to 4K because my Canon 5D2's 1080p was just too soft, and the GH4's 4K even down-res blew it away. Could I give up 4K now that the GH5 won't have an AA filter and will have full-width sensor readout in exchange for dramatically speeding up my post? Would I really need the 4K to punch in? I don't know. Speaking of 4K, how important is the non-crop moving from photo to 4K video to me? Well, that's pretty important if I'm going to shoot in 4K, because I don't want to have to buy another lens or be forced into a wide zoom I don't want just because of an added crop. How much better is the GH5's EVF and rear LCD panel than what I already have? Well, on paper, the differences should be significant, but we won't know until we go hands-on. Would they actually make a difference in my ability to focus and frame? Would it make me enjoy using it? How about you? What do you think? How important is the absence of a 30-minute recording limit? Will the GH5 truly not overheat? Now, these 2 issues are critical to me and what have prodded me more than anything else, along with the remote app, to look at Panasonic in the first place. How important is 180 frames per second in HD? Well, it depends on how good HD is. If it's really good, it will become important, although I have 120 frames per second on the 6300. How important is 60 frames per second in 4K? For me, it could become important. Neither is critical path, but these frame rates could alter my view of how many camera systems I ought to be using and what ambition I can have for production values for B-roll in documentary and other location work. How important are the superior ergonomics of the GH5 relative to my or your A camera? Now, I'm surprised to admit that the G85 is noticeably easier for me to navigate than my A6 cameras. And I suspect, I know, the GH5 will be similar. I think this is actually very important because as a 1 or 2 man band, I want as little as possible to get between me and the shot. I'm not close to Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours of experience on Sony gear, or any gear for that matter. And I don't think this is a pro versus prosumer kind of thing. How important is the full-sized HDMI port? Well, I think this depends on how comfortable I get with the EVF and LCD and how much I'm willing to trade off for mental comfort, for physical comfort. The lack of a reliable 7-inch monitor connection has been a big deal for me. But to my surprise, the irony might be that the GH5 allows me to travel without one just when it becomes easy to use. How important is having both a mic and headphone jack? To my astonishment, maybe more important than I thought. If it means I can get rid of carrying a separate audio recorder and eliminate the need to sync in post, all without losing audio quality, well, then I want it. Which leads me to wonder, how good are the GH5's preamps? I'll tell you one thing. The G85 has reinforced what I already knew using the A6300. Having a mic jack without a headphone jack on a camera, pretty useless in my book. Would the increased size and weight of the GH5 compared to my A6300 and the central location of its eyepiece bother me enough that I wouldn't like it? Well, from a form factor perspective, the G85 suggests maybe not. On a related note, would I decide I want the battery grip or the audio interface? Would this defeat the whole micro four thirds is smaller rationale? I don't know. If I had to carry only one lens with me, say for travel or video journalism, would I be satisfied with the new Leica Elmar at 12-60? I suspect not because of the variable and slow aperture, but I've been surprised before. If I wanted to go all prime, what would I be willing to spend? For what? Okay, enough. Enough, no mas, no mas. Here's what I've already done and what I'm likely to do next. I decided to pre-order the GH5. In fact, I've already done it. I see it as a complement to my Sony gear, specifically for recording conversations, and I have no intention of walking away from Sony. But the harsh reality for me is that in order to get the relevant functionality of the GH5 within the Sony family, I'd have to pony up for an FS5 or FS7. Neither the A7X II twins nor the A6500 will allow me to record past 30 minutes, and none match the GH5 for Ergo's remote app or image stabilization. Does the GH5 give me internal neutral density? Dang, no. This is the one thing that would get me to the FS5 or FS7 if I could justify the expense, but I can't. Not today. I will likely start by adding either the Leica Summilux 15mm 1.7 and or the Sigma 30mm 1.4 in order to record two shots with interesting people like Les Zellin, Perry Osting, Doug Jensen, Dan May, Juan Martinez, and others. Later in the year, I will likely add Sony's 70-200 f4 to my kit, mostly for urban landscapes. Maybe I'll go beyond the people who bring us incredible gear and filmmaking expertise to people who are incredible, period. I think this is part of my journey. Capturing people, conversations, is the single biggest reason I've pre-ordered the GH5. With no recording limit, a promise of no overheating, and as the core of an advanced Micro Four Thirds system small enough to travel super light, at a price I can't touch within the Sony lineup, it makes sense to me. Who'd have thought? Yes, it's about the gear, but no, it's about the gear. It's about the people. Now, as at least one of you has suggested in the comments section, why not go with the GX8 instead? Or, as it begs the question, two GX8s for the same price as one GH5, or two GX85s plus glass for the same price and maybe even a third. Why not just use the G85? Great questions. I just might. We'll see. Anyway, if you like what you've seen today, if it resonates with you, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation, use our links below to support the channel if you're so inclined. I can tell you that I just freaking love doing this. Love the back and forth with you in the comments section and want to do more. Flip side, please don't get upset if I don't get back to you as quickly or consistently as I have. things are getting a little bit nuts, but that's in a good way. For Three Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.